Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. We are continuing our mini-series on cycles of seven and secrets of Shabbat. Where we got to last week is we basically dealt with preparing for Shabbat. Many different laws and customs of preparing for Shabbat. And tonight we'll begin with Friday night. We mentioned a bit about Friday night. We'll go a little bit more into it. And we'll continue and we'll go through the day of Shabbat. These are little gems of ideas that have to do with the different customs and laws that we have for Shabbat. So we begin Shabbat with candle lighting. And we've mentioned this before, but it does not hurt to mention it again, is that actually, according to the halacha, the reason that we light candles is so there'll be shalom bayit. There'll be peace in the home. And the law actually, Shulchan Aruch actually brings an example, is that if there's, no light in the house, and let's say the husband trips over something that he figures should have been picked up, and he ends up yelling at his wife, well, you don't have much shalom bayit there to start Shabbos. That's the example that they bring. It's just an example. So the idea, we have to remember, this was before electricity, and without actually kindling lights, whether it was oil or kerosene, there would be no light in the house. So that's we'll call it the halachic reason. But obviously, spiritually and mystically, the idea of beginning Shabbat with light is very symbolic, very poignant, that especially, as we've said many times, this motion that women do of bringing in the light. So one of the secrets is that the numerical value for light, 207, is the same thing as Ein Sof, infinite. And so here, what we're trying to do really is to bring the infinite light of God into our Shabbat experience. And it's very fitting and significant that it's women who have this privilege of bringing in the Shabbat. As we mentioned, especially Friday night, all of Shabbat is a feminine energy, a receptive spiritual energy, but especially Friday night, as we're going to explain. And then we have Kabbalah Shabbat. Kabbalah Shabbat, we're going to use the word only, but everything is relative. Kabbalah Shabbat is only about 500 years old. It began with the Kabbalists in Tzfat at the time of the Arizal, and they would go out of the city into nature, and they would greet the Shabbat bride. Now, where did they get the idea of calling Shabbat a bride? It's actually mentioned in the Talmud. It wasn't a total innovation. That one of the sages, when Shabbat would begin, would greet the Shabbat bride. And so the Kabbalists of Tzfat picked up on this, and they created, before then there was just Mariv, the evening service. But they created a whole additional service called Kabbalah Shabbat, which means receiving the Shabbat. And it's made up of 6 psalms. And the 7th is Lecha Dodi, the very beloved poem that, of course, everyone sings for Shabbat. And the author of Lecha Dodi is actually buried right next to the Arizal, right next to him on the right side. So in our day, certainly, and we can attribute a lot of this to Reb Shlomo, is Kabbalah Shabbat. It's not his innovation either, but in many shuls, they only sing Lecha Dodi, whereas Reb Shlomo really taught a whole generation to really celebrate the inauguration of Shabbat, Kabbalah Shabbat, receiving the Shabbat upon ourselves with great joy, great joy. And it's interesting that the Psalms that were picked, almost all of them, according to tradition, were written by Moshe Rabbeinu. According to tradition, the Psalms 90 through 100 are from Moshe Rabbeinu. It's in the tractate of Baba Batra, page 15, I believe. It says explicitly that those Psalms were from Moshe Rabbeinu. And so we have 6 of them. And then we go into Lecha Dodi. Most congregations say Ana B'Koach, this very, very mystical poem of 42 words that we're told that the 42 letter name of God is encapsulated in these 42 words. And that comes right before Lecha Dodi. And of course, Lecha Dodi is greeting the Shabbat bride. Lecha Dodi likrat kala pnei Shabbat nikabala. Let us go, my beloved. And here we're speaking to God. God is the beloved here. Let us go together, likrat Shabbat, and greet the Shabbat. So the masculine feminine energy is very, very present in all of Shabbat, but specifically Kabbalah Shabbat is the feminine energy, the Shekhinah, and Shabbat, just as a grammatical word, is in the feminine. That's why we say Shabbatot, because it's a feminine word. So in the prayers of Friday night, so we say two different allusions to the unity of masculine and feminine. And this is right before the Amida. So we sing Vishamru. Vishamru b'nei Yisrael et Shabbat. This is one of Reb Shlomo's nigunim that have been picked up all over the world. And in the words, it begins, Vishamru b'nei Yisrael et Shabbat. So if you look at the acronym, the Roshei Tevot of the words B'nei Yisrael et Shabbat, the words that follow Vishamru, meaning that the children of Israel should guard the Shabbat. Vishamru B'nei Yisrael et Shabbat. So if you look at the first letters of B'nei Yisrael et Shabbat, it's Bet, Yud, Aleph, Hey, which spells out the word Bia. Bia is one of the words that the sages used to indicate marital unity, intimate marital unity. It's called Bia. So here you have it hinted to in the Shabbat. And then Shamru continues, Beini ubein b'nei Yisrael ot hi leolam. Between me, this is God speaking, between me and the children of Israel, it is an everlasting sign. So again, if you look at the acronym of B'nai Yisrael, OT, the children of Israel, the Shabbat is a sign, a special sign. Again, it spells the same thing. Bet for B'nai, Yud for Yisrael, Aleph for Ot, and Hey for Hu. Again, it spells this word Bia, which means intimate relations. So we're told in the Talmud that the most appropriate or auspicious time for husbands and wives to be together is on Shabbat. And so these two hints, these two acronyms, it's called an asmachta. It's a biblical support for this idea of the unity of masculine and feminine, really all the time, but especially on Shabbat. Now, in the Amidah of all the prayers of Shabbat, we usually call the Amidah, meaning another name for the Amidah, the standing prayer, is the Shmona Esrei, the 18 blessings. Even though today we have 19 blessings, but originally there were 18 blessings. And that's what we daven Shachrit, Mincha, and Marav every day. Morning, afternoon, and evening prayer is 18, or today 19 blessings. But on Shabbat, there's 7 blessings. And the first 3 and the last 3 of every Amidah are the same. They're praise and acknowledgement of God. And in the middle, during the week, we have today 13, we'll call them requests, 13 prayers that we're requesting from God different things. But on Shabbat, we're told we don't make requests. So there's only one middle blessing on Shabbat. But it's significant that now on Shabbat, we have 7 blessings, which obviously fits into the whole connection between Shabbat and the number 7. And Shabbat actually being called Yom HaShvi'i, the 7th day. After the evening prayer, so when we come home, the practically universal custom is to sing Shalom Aleichem, where we greet the angels. We say Shalom Aleichem to the Malachei Asharet, to the administrating angels of the King of Kings. And there are 4 stanzas. Each stanza has 3 lines to them. And first we greet them, Shalom Aleichem. Then we say, Boachem l'shalom, come in peace. Borchuni l'shalom, bless me with peace. And Seitchem l'shalom, and you shall leave in peace. I believe I mentioned already in the series that even though it's a virtually universal custom today, when it was first revealed, many rabbis had a problem with it. And I remember we discussed this, the idea of asking angels to bless us. And some of the rabbis said, Ma pitom, that angels are giving us blessings. God gives us blessings. So we had a whole discussion how appropriate it is to say Borchuni l'shalom, but obviously all of Am Yisrael has taken this upon themselves, and we know that angels are messengers of God. So if we ask angels to bless us, it's as if we're asking God to bless us. It's significant that there are 12 lines to it, 3 in each stanza. Now, of course, there are 12 tribes, and the way that we marched in the desert was a similar formula, where there were 3 tribes on each of the 4 cardinal directions. So here, it's like we're surrounded by angels. And the reason I say that is one of the reasons that we were told to march in this way in the desert is because we're told that in heaven, the throne of glory, God's throne of glory, is surrounded on 4 sides by camps of angels. And there are 4 archetypal angels: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel. These are the 4 archetypal angels. And we're told that they're, again, in symbolic language, they are camped around the throne of glory, just like we in the desert camped around the tabernacle, the Mishkan. So this is a very beautiful thing, that when we sing Shalom Aleichem and we're relating to the angels, we can imagine ourselves truly being surrounded, because this is something we learned last week, the idea that our home is like the tabernacle. We attempt to turn our home into a holy place, a mishkan, a temple for God. And all of the elements of Shabbat correspond to the different elements in the temple and the tabernacle. And so just like Am Yisrael camped around the Mishkan, so we can imagine as we're singing the song that we're surrounded by angels on all 4 sides. It's actually a very, very beautiful visualization. Now, along with some people having the problem with the idea of asking angels to bless us, some people had a problem. Why are we sending the angels away? Seivchem l'shalom. Here we greet them and we say, come in peace and bless us in peace. Why would we send them away? Seivchem l'shalom. So there are people who actually don't say the last stanza because they don't want to say go. So what is an understanding of going? I heard this from Reb Shlomo, a beautiful explanation. We know that we're told that even though we think of angels being far more spiritual than we are, in a certain way, we're told very clearly that we're higher than angels, because angels don't have free will. And having free will, with all of the challenges and problems of having free will, and having a yetzer hara, an evil inclination, which gives us the ability to choose, we're told we're actually in a higher level. And the verse they learned this from is from the vision of Zechariah that we actually read. It was a haftarah in Parshat Bahalotcha. And we actually read it a second time. It's one of the only haftarahs that we repeat twice in a year, because we read it on Shabbos Hanukkah also, is the haftarah. The vision of Zechariah, and part of that vision is with the menorah, the light of the menorah. So in Parshat Balotcha, it begins by talking about the menorah. That's why we read the Haftarah. The Haftarah always follows something in the Parsha. And of course, Hanukkah, the Chanukiah represents the menorah. So that's the Haftarah. And in this vision, so an angel is speaking and explaining things to Zechariah. And he says about human beings, about Jews, they are walkers amidst those who are standing still. And so it's explained who is walking and who's standing still. So we're told that it's the angels who are standing still, even though they may seem to, as it were, be able to fly all over the place. And we're more static, but we're told because they don't have free will, that in a spiritual sense, angels don't progress. They are who they are, and there is no spiritual growth to angels, whereas a human being has tremendous potential to grow. And so we're called walkers among those who are standing. And so one of the explanations of why do we say Seitchem l'shalom? So it's as if we're saying to the angels, thank you so much for accompanying us home. Thank you so much for being with us. But we have to tell you, where we go on Shabbat, you can't even reach there. Where we're reaching on Shabbat, so we'll say goodbye to you. And you should have a good journey back to where you come from, because where we're going spiritually, you're standing in place. You can't accompany us. I always found that explanation just very uplifting, very encouraging, inspiring. That here we're at the beginning of Shabbat, and we're like plugging into this idea that where we can go on Shabbat, even the angels can't go. After Shalom Aleichem, and people have different orders here. So I'm going to mention three things, but some people do it in different order. Then we sing Eshet Chayil, a woman of valor. A woman of valor is the last chapter of the book of Proverbs, written by Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon. I believe it's the 31st chapter, but it's the last chapter of the book of Proverbs. And there are different versions of where is the source, like who wrote it for who. So one of them is that Shlomo is actually writing it for his mother, Bathsheba. Bathsheba, of course, was, of all of King David's wives, she was the closest to a soulmate. And in fact, the Midrash or the Gemara says that David and Bathsheba were destined for each other from Sheshet Yemei Bereshit, from the 6 days of creation. They were meant for each other. Unfortunately, David saw this. When he first saw Bathsheba, it was immediate recognition that this is my soulmate. But just like Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, couldn't wait till Shabbat to eat from the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra, and we're told that had they waited till Shabbat, they could have eaten not only from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but also from the tree of life. And so we're told it was a similar type of wrongdoing here. And David didn't have the patience, and he took Bathsheba on the spot. Later, he did tshuva for it the rest of his life. And we're told that David paved the way for all generations to learn how to do tshuva. So that's one version, that King Shlomo wrote it for his mother. Another version is Avram wrote it for Sarah. Okay, Avram wrote it for Sarah. Now there's approximately 700 years between Avram and Shlomo. And we have this throughout Jewish history where certain works are attributed to one person, but there's also a tradition that the initial inspiration or the initial framework for whatever is being discussed comes from a much earlier time. This happens very, very often, very, very often, where we'll have different traditions as to who composed or compiled or wrote certain things. And then we'll have an earlier tradition. This happens very, very often. This is not a subject we can get into right now. So here we have two different versions. And as usual, we'll say they're probably both correct. Shlomo probably received a tradition of how Avram praised Sarah and somehow incorporated it into the book of Proverbs. Anyways, it's so fitting that men sing this to their wives on Shabbat evening. Of course, there's no black and white anymore, but customarily, women are doing the bulk of the work preparing for Shabbat. Like I say, it's not in our day, especially where women work and men work in the house, women work in the house. But throughout tradition, throughout history, throughout all the generations, it was considered very appropriate and good to acknowledge and praise one's wife on Erev Shabbat. Again, we don't have time to go through the whole song now, but a very, very beautiful song. Many, many ideas come out of Eshet Chayil. And then there is the idea of blessing our children. This is a very, very beloved custom where when Yaakov blessed Ephraim and Manasseh, so it's actually written in the Torah that he blessed them. Yisimcha Elokim ke Ephraim u'kManasseh. That may God place you like Ephraim and Manasseh. In other words, you should be in a position to be blessed like Ephraim and Manasseh. And one of the reasons that this is chosen is because after a whole book of Bereshit of sibling rivalries, of siblings killing siblings, of selling their brother, all kinds of jealousies and love-hate relationships. Here, one would think this would just be another one because Yosef was expecting his father to first bless Manasseh, who was the firstborn. And instead, Yaakov insisted on blessing first Ephraim and then Manasseh. So you would say this is a perfect setup for another rivalry. And yet we don't see that it manifested. We don't see that it manifested. And so here, this is like the classic case of tikkun. Later, a second example that's brought down is Moshe and Aaron. Aaron is the elder. And in fact, at the burning bush, Moshe said, Shalach biyad tishlach. I know of someone better than me, my brother. Pick him. God insisted that it would be Moshe. Of course, Aaron became the high priest. But here, even though, again, we could say that Aaron had maybe reason to be jealous and upset at Moshe, but it never manifested. He was Moshe's greatest supporter. And it's interesting because here in Eretz Yisrael this week we're reading Parshat Korach, which is Korach, who is a cousin of Moshe, is blinded by jealousy. He was considered a very righteous person until this incident, but jealousy got the better of him, almost like sibling rivalry. So it's a very, very precious custom to bless our children. So for the boy, and we do it with Birchat Kohanim. For boys, it's Yisimcha Elokim Ke'Ephraim u'Ke'Menashe, and then Birchat Kohanim. And for ladies, so it's Yisimech Elokim Ke'Sara Rivka Rachel B'Leah. That's not written in the Torah, but it seemed obvious that since the boys are being blessed with a verse from the Torah, Yisimcha, so it seemed like an obvious one for the girls to be Yisimech Elokim Kisar Rivka Rachel B'Leah. And I know many people whose children are not at home for Shabbat. Children grow up, they get married, they move away. And so many people do it different ways, but I know of many people who it's just part of their Friday ritual. They will reach their children on the phone, or the children will reach the parents, and they'll do it over the phone, Erev Shabbos. I do it differently. I send mine long distance. I hold up my hands as if I'm putting it on their head, and I mentally send it long distance. They all know that I'm doing it. So hopefully they pick up on it. Okay, and then we make Kiddush. We make Kiddush Friday night, again during the day. At night, it's considered a Torah mandated mitzvah. That's the way we sanctify the Shabbat. That's how we Zachor v'Shamor. We remember and guard the Shabbat. So remembering is connected to sanctifying. We remember to sanctify the Shabbat. And the sages say, well, how do we sanctify the Shabbat? By making Kiddush. That's how we do it. It can be grape juice, it could be wine. And different people have different customs. Sometimes the man of the house will bless everyone, including all the guests. In some households, any male guest will also make their own Kiddush. Different people do different things. One second. We've discussed Kiddush before, but I'll mention again in this context that the idea is that we're giving testimony to our, call it our belief, but more than that, to our witnessing that God created heaven and earth. It's in the words of the Kiddush, and that God sanctified the Shabbat in the days of creation. And we're giving testimony. Virtually everyone, though there are rare occasions where people sit for Kiddush Friday night. Many people sit for Kiddush during the day to show a difference between a Doraita, a Torah mandated mitzvah, and a rabbinic Kiddush during the day is rabbinic. But at night we stand, and we're standing to give testimony. So the classic question is, how can we give testimony if we weren't there? I can say I received this from tradition that God created heaven and earth, or I could say I believe it. I wasn't there, but I believe that it's true. But what about giving witness that God created heaven and earth as if I was there? So the answer we give at a very, very spiritual level is we were there. Our souls were there at creation. And here we have a number of different sources for this. And the two of them that I'm going to mention are, when God wanted to create the world, Yisrael Allah b'machshava techila, that the thought of Israel arose first. Even before the creation, God was already not just thinking of Israel, because the other midrash says that God took advice. God consulted with the souls of the tzaddikim before creation. Obvious question: what's tzaddikim? There's no world. Nothing's been created yet. So who are these tzaddikim? And so the answer is, these are the future souls of the tzaddikim, of the righteous, who are already part of God. And that's why we say that the divine soul is a chalak eloka mima'al mamash, an actual part of God above. And so here we could actually say we were at creation. We are witnesses. It's not just something handed down over the ages that God created the heavens and earth and sanctified the Shabbat. We were there. So this is just, I just love this idea. When I'm making Kiddush, I very often think of kind of like a pre-creation experience of being part of God and somehow being a partner with God. So this is very interesting, because the sages say someone who makes Kiddush Friday night becomes a partner with God in the creation of heaven and earth. So we're actual partners. God consulted our souls. So this takes a lot of contemplation. It's like really a good meditation to try to understand what this Kiddush Torah is talking about. Okay, then we wash hands and we make hamotzi. We'll get to it in a minute, but we eat 3 meals on Shabbat. And the 3 meals of Shabbat are, we'll call them official meals. They're called Sudat Mitzvah, Torah-mandated feasts. And the definition of a Torah-mandated feast is eating bread. That is what gives it its gushpanka. It's the category of being an official Suda mitzvah. And so we have 3 on Shabbat. And at all of them, we have a tradition to have 2 breads. I believe I mentioned already that the Arizal would have 12 breads to correspond to the 12 loaves of showbread in the temple. And he would have 12 breads, and many, many Hasidic families have 12 breads. But the standard is to have 2 breads. And where does this come from? It comes from the granting by God of the manna, the food from heaven. And it's in Parshat B'Shalach when the manna began. There's a whole explanation of it, but one of the explanations is that God says 6 days there'll be manna, but there will be none on Shabbat. And it was forbidden to go out looking for it. God says there won't be any. But I'll give you a double portion on Friday. This became the source of having 2 breads at every meal. And one of the other customs is always to cover the bread and to put it on some kind of a tray or plate. And this comes from the same story of the manna, that we're told that the manna would come and there would be a coating of tal. We learned this last week about tal. Tal of dew equals 39, and its connection with the 39 forbidden works on Shabbat. But we're told that underneath the man, in Hebrew, the manna is called man, and above it, there was a layer of dew. And so therefore, we cover the bread and we put it on a tray also as a remembrance of the manna. And the idea of getting a double portion on Shabbat, so this is a beautiful idea because we're not cooking on Shabbat. We're doing everything on Friday. I mean, there's certain things that you could do on Shabbat, but basically the food preparations are being done on Friday. So this idea of a double a double portion that we're getting on Friday, well, that rolls over into Shabbat. So those are the two loaves of bread. Now, I can't remember which Hasidic Rebbe said the following, but it's a beautiful idea. And the blessing for the bread is Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz, who brings out bread from the earth. Now, the word for bread, lechem, the 3 letters lechem, are also the same 3 letters of the root of the word dream, chalom. It's the same 3 letters of salt, melach, and it's the same 3 letters as a soldier, a fighter, is called a lochem. So what's the connection? So first of all, let's do the salt and the bread. We have a custom of dipping this bread in salt. Why? Is because our table is considered like an altar, and our food is the offerings. And we're told in the Torah that all of the offerings that were offered up on the altar had salt accompany them. So here, the beautiful idea is that the same letters of salt are the same letters of bread. So this idea of dipping your bread in salt is in the very letters of the words. Now I'll mention also a gematria here. The gematria of bread is 78. 78 is 3 times 26. 26 is the name of God, the 4-letter name of God. And therefore, you'll see many people have a custom that they dip the bread in salt 3 times in order to indicate this is a holy meal that we're about to eat. This is a opportunity to connect to God. And this is a general principle where we take one of the most animalistic pursuits of eating. And if anyone's ever been like really hungry, I don't mean just a little hungry, I mean like really hungry, and then you have a chance to eat, you can almost feel the animal going after it. But eating can kind of be drawn down to a very, very animal type of activity, or it can be raised up to something beautiful and holy and spiritual. So, especially on Shabbat, where we have special kavanas, but during the week also we wash for bread, we dip it in salt, we say a blessing. All of these ideas is to take worldly activities and make something spiritual and holy and pure, and an opportunity to connect to God. So here we see that the dipping of the bread in the salt 3 times reminds us that this meal is an opportunity to connect to God. So going back to the 3 letters of lechem. So we have dreams, fighting, and bread. So I don't know where it comes from, but at some point someone made up a phrase that some people fight for bread, meaning like between people and between nations, a lot of times it's over territory, economics. Land is sustenance. And so some people fight over bread, other people fight to fulfill their dreams. Again, chalom, dreams, is the same letters as fight and the same letter as bread. So that's a beautiful connection. Some people fight for bread, other people fight to fulfill their dreams. Now back to this saying by this Hasidic Rebbe. So since that the word lechem is the same in the same order as lochem, to fight. So this Rebbe had a kavana, and when he would say hamotzi lechem mina oretz, he would say, God, please take out fighting from the earth. Hamotzi lechem, hamotzi lochem min haaretz. So this is one of these Torahs that you learn, and it sticks with you. So many, many times when I say hamotzi, I have this in mind. Hashem, please take out fighting for bread in this world. Just take it away. Okay, now we just want to establish this idea of eating 3 meals on Shabbat. Where do we get this from? Well, we could just answer, well, most people eat dinner, and the next day they'll eat lunch, and then by the end of Shabbat, they eat dinner again. So what's the big deal here? But it's actually learned from a verse, again, about the manna. I'm just looking for it. Give me a second. Oh, here it is. For those who want to look it up later, it's in the book of Shemot, Tet Zayin, Pasuk Chaf Hey. It's in the book of Exodus, the 16th chapter, the 25th verse. It says like this, V'yomer Moshe, Ichluhu hayom. This is Moshe talking to the people, the instructions he got from God. Moshe says, Ichluhu hayom, eat it today, ki Shabbat hayom, because today is Shabbat. Excuse me, I'll go back. Ichluhu hayom, ki Shabbat hayom lashem. It is a day, it's a Shabbat, a day for Hashem. Hayom lo tinsa'uhu b'sadeh. Today, meaning on Shabbat, you will not find it in the field. So if you notice, the word Hayom is repeated 3 times in the same verse. I'll read it again so you can hear it. Hayom. V'yomer Moshe, Ichluhu Hayom, ki Shabbat Hayom Lashem, Hayom lo timsa'u b'sadeh. So the sages say that this is, again, it's what's called an asmachta, a biblical support for the idea of eating 3 meals on Shabbat, because like I said, it makes logical sense to eat 3 meals. But here they found a support for the idea with the manna. Now, what's interesting here is that the one statement in the Talmud says, anyone who eats bread at the 3rd meal will be spared the travails of the Messianic era. Anyone who eats bread at the 3rd meal will be spared the travails, the trials of the Messianic era. Now, many people don't eat bread at the 3rd meal, and it is somewhat optional. The first 2 meals, it's really halacha. 3rd meal is somewhat optional. The sages gave us some sound advice. If you want to be safe in the travails of the Messianic era, eat bread. And I remember I learned this approximately 30 years ago. And until then, sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. But when I learned this, it was like, I'm breaking bread every 3rd meal. And I have ever since. Now, what's interesting is Chabad doesn't eat bread at the 3rd meal. And there's many reasons for it, but one of them is from this verse. Because remember, the idea of 3 meals is coming from the word hayom, today. So the 3rd one, the 3rd hayom says, hayom lo timsa'u b'sadeh. Today you will not find it in the field. So that is, in a sense, a support for not eating bread at the 3rd meal. We'll call it a deeper reason is, and we'll get to it, but I already mentioned that in many traditions, 3rd meal is considered the highest of all the meals. And again, I'm going to quote from Reb Shlomo, who said, Kabbalah Shabbat is high. 3rd meal is deep. Meaning the joy and the simcha of Kabbalah Shabbat is like high energy. It's like electric energy. 3rd meal is deep. It's a different energy altogether. So many people consider the 3rd meal the deepest part of Shabbat. And therefore, it's more appropriate to be singing and saying Divrei Torah than eating, even though everyone eats a little bit of something. Anyways, there's really no right and wrong here. There are different customs, and people find different reasons for different customs. Okay, one last thing, and I have to admit, I don't do it anymore, but for many, many, many years, I would fulfill this teaching. And it says in the Talmud that Shabbos is 1/60th of the world to come. So that can be interpreted in many different ways. One of the ways of interpreting it is that if you keep Shabbat in this world, you'll be rewarded with the world to come. Others go farther and say that keeping Shabbat, experiencing Shabbat, is 1/60th of the world to come. So there's this idea that every moment of Shabbat is precious, and especially Friday night. We already said the third meal is many consider the deepest part of Shabbat. But there is something about Friday night that's also high energy. And it was said that anyone who stays up to midnight Friday night, they are experiencing the world to come. Meaning, if we don't fall into rote and routine and fall asleep during the meal, like some people do, it's a long week, especially in the summer where we're not davening until later, and the meal can go quite late. It's not unusual to see people nodding out at the meal. But the idea is that if someone could stay up to midnight, it's as if you're in the world to come. And I know for years, my wife and I would stay up till midnight on Friday night. Now, a little bit in our elderly years, it's not as easy. I'm sure some of you out there can understand that. But it is a beautiful practice, and that's why Shabbos is for rest. We do rest more on Shabbos, and it's good to rest. It's part of Shabbat. Actually, the letters Shabbat is Shena b'Shabbat Ta'anug. The shin of Shabbat is Shena, sleep. B'Shabbat, on Shabbat, Ta'anug is a pleasure. But many, many people take a nap on Friday afternoon so they can stay up Friday night. And it's a very, very good practice, because especially for those who work very hard during the week, and a lot of times we go into Shabbat really exhausted, really tired. And in a sense, it's a shame, because yes, Shabbat is for rest, but Friday night is so precious that people should think ahead of doing their cooking on Thursday night, or doing their shopping during the week and not waiting till Friday, cleaning their houses beforehand, and have time to rest. If you remember last week, we learned from Rav Soloveitchik, who said in the old country, people knew how to do Erev Shabbat. But here in America, people don't know about Erev Shabbat. So this is just an idea. It's good to rest a little bit on Friday afternoon, so we can stay up a little bit and really enjoy the high energy of Shabbat. So today we got through Friday night. Of course, we didn't say everything that there is to say, but hopefully everyone got a few gems that will help with your Shabbat experience. And as always, we end with a blessing that the more we learn about Shabbat, hopefully the more inspired we are to get everything we can out of Shabbat, and not just go through even though the motions are beautiful, going to shul and having chicken soup and having gefilte fish and singing some Zmirot, but there's a certain place where we need to up the ante and really squeeze everything we can out of the Shabbat experience.